תודה לדוברי המושב הפתיחה.
Thank you to those who said their greeting remarks. And now we're going to begin the first session that deals with the efficiency and accessibility of early childhood frameworks. The chair is Dr. Naomi Moreno, director of the Early Childhood Dialogue. She is a senior executive veteran in the field of education, welfare, and community, and is the director of Early Childhood Dialogue, who provides early childhood services, particularly quality and safety of care. Those are the primary issues at the moment. She is head of the subcommittee for early childhood frameworks, and she is a member of various professional forums, the early childhood committee, and also the Maslulim organization for the promotion of children from the social periphery. The stage is yours. Good morning to everyone. I am so thankful for the opportunity to be part of this conference and to begin the first session that focuses on early childhood frameworks of care and education, everything that has to do with their efficiency, their accessibility, availability, as of today in Israel. This session, it will be basically the foundation for the other sessions. It will include recent studies, findings of research. There are a lot of studies that were done in the past from various angles, but we're going to compare that to today. And all of that teaches us on the importance of the issue. How? In the sense that this age is important. This is a very important window of an opportunity. This has already been discussed. This is important because quality frameworks make the difference. That is what makes the difference. Quality frameworks for children are what make the difference, and therefore it's enormously important what frameworks, regulation, 1,001 parameters that are important in order to create that quality. Particularly for children that are at risk, and for early childhood, that is also important because it relates to, of course, narrowing the inequality gap, having social accessibility, narrowing social gaps, improving, everything that has already been talked about in the opening remarks, that all relates to early childhood frameworks. And in fact, because they're doubly important, not only because they're in early childhood, but because they relate to education. And so all of studies from whatever perspective, they don't contradict that statement. They only clarify that statement, clarify the importance, and raise more points to examine. What else happened? And I think this has already also been mentioned in a way. There is public debate, public willingness and awareness for early childhood education. It began in the 2011 social protest, and then another protest, and we see that there's violence in the street in early childhood frameworks, and the legislation in the last few decades, that layer upon layer of legislation and a lot of new partners. A decade ago, had we sat in this kind of a debate, I think our partners would have been far fewer. And so there is a willingness today. There is an orientation in the public, in academia, in various circles, and yet still we know that the gaps exist. So this challenge, this gap, this variance, that is something that we must examine and are trying to, as well as in this session, to hear what research findings demonstrate and see what can be done. Because research and policy that is there to create and establish a new reality, what are the research findings that will be able to focus our efforts and see what can be done differently? And maybe also talk about the why this has happened. So I'd like to begin by presenting our session participants. The first to speak is Noam Zontag. Noam is a researcher in the Taub Center in social research, has a master's in environment from the Hebrew University. In the past was Economist in the Council for Higher Education, and will present new findings on the comparisons of various frameworks and their impact on child achievement. Afterwards, we'll hear from Shavit Madhala. Shavit is a researcher also in Taub Center, has a master's in agricultural economics and the excellence of excellent students track, deals with welfare in the labor market, and also a member of various committees. She's going to present new findings on availability and accessibility of frameworks, early childhood frameworks in the Arab sector. The next is Elad Demalach. He is an economist in the research division of the Bank of Israel, and also a lecturer in the Tel Aviv University. He's a doctorate there, examining the various impacts on society of various social reforms, such as the mandatory early childhood education and long education day has impact, and was examined and will examine how mandatory education from age 3 has had social and economic impact on comparison to those who did not participate in the program. This part of the session then finally will be discussed by Dr. Tali Yariv-Mashal. He's the Director General of the Beracha Foundation, has a PhD from Columbia that dealt with comparative economics of various societies. That also worked in the Education Society, the Seminar Kibbutzim Academic College, and developed various education programs for various organizations. She's going to examine the various cross-sectorial impact of these frameworks and policy and its impact in the field. And we're going to discuss also together two major issues. One has to do with the accessibility of early childhood frameworks among various populations, various sectors of Israeli society, how it manifests, and try to understand who are the players in this arena, along with our participants. And as time will permit, I hope we'll have enough time also for questions from the audience and from those watching via Zoom. So thank you very much. And Noam Zontag, if you would. Hello, and good day to everybody. I'd like to present a study that we did in the Taub Center in the initiative for dealing with the inequality gap in early childhood. And the core of this was really to examine, is there a correlation between the presence of children in early childhood frameworks and their academic achievements several years later when they get to school? And what we examined were two major questions. First is a preliminary question. Is there a connection between the socioeconomic background of the children and the likelihood that they would be in early childhood frameworks? I assume here you wouldn't be surprised, but you know the answer to this, but we had to establish that. The second part is the primary part of the study. Is the length of stay in these frameworks in early childhood, length of stay in these frameworks related to academic achievements later in school? Now, when I say early childhood frameworks, what do I mean? I mean all of them at this point. We examined also more specifically certain things, but we're not going to present that now. So I mean child care centers, creches, early pre-K frameworks. This is based on 3 databases. The first is the social survey of 2004 by the Central Bureau of Statistics, focusing on educational frameworks. So we had good information in regards to education frameworks for early childhood. We incorporated that with the Mitzav achievement scores of these children later on. That's the first database. The second is the Pearls test from 2016 that studies literacy in grade 4. And the third was the PISA findings from 2018. Now, these are complementary, meaning the fact that we have 3 sources is not because we have such a richness and abundance of data, quite the opposite. They all have very significant limitations, even these 3. That's why we used 3 in order to triangulate and try to complete the picture. So the first question is, are there gaps between socioeconomic background and the measure of participation in frameworks? So what you see here in turquoise are the children who are not in any framework. Where are they? Either with one of the parents at home or with another family member, a grandmother, an aunt maybe. And the orange in the diagram shows you all the various frameworks from creches and daycares and so forth. And what we see very clearly is that children who have a mother with a higher level of education do go to early childhood frameworks or have a higher propensity and at a much higher level, meaning the difference is very, very clear and very, very significant here. We also examined it according to level of income. Obviously, the data here is the 2004 data. Yes, I'm just noting that. We also examined it according to level of economic status. We saw it according to the various percentiles, and the more that the higher the income in that family household, the higher the probability that the children will go to some framework. I'm not going to get into the question, the chicken and the egg, so to speak, what comes first. If you have a higher income, you send children to kindergarten, or if you send your children to kindergarten, then the mother goes out to the labor force and makes more money. I don't know. We're not dealing with that question at the moment. And the third point is the biggest gaps that we have in Israel between the Jewish and Arab sectors in regards to participation in such frameworks. The data here, and again, this is very noteworthy, from 2004. Today, the data, the gaps have been narrowed, but even in the current data that we have from the recent years, we know that fewer Arab children attend frameworks in early childhood. I don't want to talk about this because later speakers will specifically talk about the Arab sector. So now I talk about our main study question. A child went to a daycare center or a framework. Is there a correlation between the number of years they went to that framework and their achievements later on at school? So we did Pearls, we had the Pearls test, and we have the Mitzav and PISA. We did a lot of analyses. We can't look, and we did a lot of regression analyses because I did want to include the Pearls one because there's one interesting interaction that I want to talk about in just a second. So the dependent variable was the 2016 Pearls scores of each child. Okay, so this is the gaps between the Jewish and Arab populations, and I'm moving on to the regression analysis. So as stated, we did a lot of regressions, but I'm showing the Pearls analysis where the Pearls 2016 was the variable we examined. In the first, was what I'm showing you here, the number of years that children stay in these frameworks. Clearly, children that were 4 years or more in early childhood frameworks had a higher achievements in the Pearls test. Now, the other parameters, the other variables, are what we more or less expected, and they're all statistically significant. But I want to refer you to the interaction a variable, because we did a very interaction between the level of years of education of the mother and 4 years or more for the child in a framework, and we saw a clear, significantly a clear negative correlation, and I'm going to show you this in the graph here. This graph is based on the regression of pearls that I showed you just now. And each one of these circles is a mean of a score, an average of the achievements. And the lines at the top of the bottom are the limits to it. And you can see here on the children to academic mothers or academically or educated mothers, they will get slightly higher scores, but this is not statistically significant. But children to non-academically educated mothers, if the children were 4 years or more in the framework, they do get a higher score, significantly so. If we allow ourselves maybe to broaden the scope for a moment, then we may conclude from this potentially that children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, for them, that early childhood framework is particularly important, even more than children from a better socioeconomic status. Another point that I want to present to you, and this is what we based on the PISA data, it has to do with the younger children that begin schooling in a year at the age of 1 or 2 years. Now, PISA, in addition to asking children various things, one of the things asked in PISA is at what year did you start kindergarten and or a childhood framework, and we then saw that then we compared it to the year, to the scores that they had in the PISA. This is from 2018. The start is from 2018. So let's look at the right side. That's for the Jewish sector. The earlier the child begins a framework, they get a higher score from the age of 3 and up, from the age of 3. But then that is what, in that sense, it's very similar to what we saw in the other regressions that we saw in the other variables. But when we examine what happened for younger children that begin a framework, then the picture is a lot less clear, because overall we understand that the longer you stay in the frameworks, in childhood, early childhood frameworks, the better the scores. But it's not clear, is it also relevant to very, very young children beginning some kind of framework? Now, this finding, because we had several sort of data limitations that had to do with the way that the question was phrased in the questionnaire, in PISA, and the fact that later on the age of 16, when you ask children at the age of 16 when they start going to a framework, and their answers are not absolutely clear, so it wasn't solid data. Later on, after we completed, one of our researchers in the team, Chai Vaknim and Professor Yossi Shavit, are now conducting, in fact, still a research and also found that that beginning attending some kind of framework at a very early age, 0 to 3, does not correlate to Pearl's scores, and in fact may potentially have a negative correlation. So, but that's ongoing. So I'm going to summarize our current study findings. First of all, children from a higher socioeconomic background were at a higher propensity to attend early childhood frameworks, and generally speaking, Jews attend them more than Arabs. A second finding that we saw from age 3 and up, a positive correlation between the number of years in that framework and a higher score in later testing. And the third finding, at least in terms of the Pearl's academic achievement scores, the weaker socioeconomic background children enjoy, so to speak, or benefit more from going to an early childhood framework. These are the findings that we found to be statistically significant. Now, I want to talk about 2 additional findings that are more reserved. First of all, one of the regressions that we ran indicated that supervised frameworks maybe are more beneficial than non-supervised. We had data limitations, so here we're not going to be very decisive and firm of this, but this certainly is worthy of continued research, this gap. And another point that has to do with the very young children. Very young children, the point is maybe less definitive. Thank you very much.
בוקר טוב.
Good morning. I'm going to show you the findings of a study that's now being finalized and is soon to be published from the Taub Center, that I conducted with Dr. Laviv Shami, Professor Johnny Gal, and Alon Sela. And this really deals with the attendance in early childhood, in supervised early childhood frameworks in Arab society. We wanted to examine the gaps that exist in the level of attendance of Arab society compared to other populations in Israel, and see what are the causes for these gaps, and talk about alternatives or recommendations in terms of policy. So we're beginning with a bit of background information in terms of the scope. We can see, according to the recent data from 2018-2019, that 24% of early childhood, of children in the early childhood 0 to 3 age range go to a supervised and subsidized state-run kindergarten, and children, these are in children either in daycare, some of them in creches, mishpachton in Hebrew, and they divide into two basic groups: a small at-risk infants that are referred by welfare departments and they're put in some kind of boarding situation, and the vast majority are children that are children of parents that are either studying or working. So now we look at the same, the rate of those children 0 to age 3 in those frameworks, and their various division in the various populations: Haredis, non-Haredi, mixed, that have a high level of Arab population. And what we see here, there were very significant gaps between the various populations and their attendance in early childhood frameworks. So we see the 2019 attendance numbers in Arab municipalities. It was it was very low, it's less than 40%. There is an overall increase in attendance in these frameworks. We see that in less than a decade, the number of attendance raised from 10% to 18% among Arabs, but there are still very significant gaps. Moreover, we see that in terms of the division between creches and daycare centers, mishpachtonim and meonot in Hebrew, we see a relatively low number of attendance in daycare centers and a particularly high level in creches, according to the various, and in comparison to the other populations. And this is again because of the level of poverty, the very high level of poverty in Arab society. We maybe would expect a higher level of attendance in the supervised and subsidized frameworks by the state, but in fact it's opposite, and the findings do not show that. In terms of the composition of children who do attend these frameworks, we see that not only that the level of attendance of Arab children is low, but among those who do go, a large number of those who do in fact attend are considered at-risk youth that are referred to by welfare factors. So as you can imagine, if we, only look at children of working parents and we completely exclude at-risk children, we see even greater gaps in terms of the number of 0 to 3 age children who attend. Arab children, only 8% go to some kind of framework. I'm talking about children of working parents versus the 29% and 23% among the Jewish populations, Haredi and non-Haredi. So after we saw these differences, and the study also reveals other differences as well in terms of frameworks, we tried to focus the major explanations for this low attendance through interviews that we conducted with the education professionals, with mothers, Arab mothers of very young children. Also, the Taub Center provided us with additional data and concentrated on 4 major potential causes for this low attendance of Arab children. First of all, it has to do with the municipalities. That has to do, for example, with preferences of mothers, Arab mothers or Arab households that they believe that it's more correct that a very young child should stay at home and taken care of by a family member and not to be sent outside the home at that age. I would say that in terms of the trends, when we look at the trends of attendance of Arab children in such frameworks, there is an increase, as I showed you, in the supervised frameworks, but also attendance in private kindergartens. So apparently this issue is becoming less valid as a reason for explaining the general overall low attendance of Arab children. Another potential cause that may obstruct the accessibility of such frameworks is employment rates among Arab women that we know that is low. We know that this is also true of children who do not have children of this age, and particularly of Arab mothers who do have very young kids, very low employment rates and a big gap between employment rates of Arab women in compared to other populations. This already creates an obstruction to sending a child to a framework because they're not entitled to subsidies, first of all, because they're not working, and their children have a lot lower level of entitlement to be accepted into such a framework with a non-working mother. And I think this issue really raises a very big general question in regards to defining the goal of such frameworks. Is the point of such a childhood framework to be a way to encourage women to go out to work, or is there an additional reason for such frameworks to provide an educational framework that provides equal education quality available to everybody? That's a big question that I think that we have to address. What is the role or roles, plural, of such early childhood frameworks? Other potential problems have to do with transportation and mobility of mothers, bureaucratic problems that have to do with registering and assigning the child. If it's online, for example, it requires a computer and you have to have a credit card. And of course, the hours of activity of such frameworks, that's something we heard in the interviews. In Arab society, a large number of the mothers work part-time jobs. They maybe would prefer, or better for them, only to send their child for part of the day to a framework. That's not possible with these state-run or supervised framework. It's a full day or nothing. That's also something that we saw as a barrier. Another third potential cause has to do with the presence or the existence rather of such kindergartens and frameworks in any community. If there's a smaller number, then you have less availability for people. If you want to send your child, you have less options. We saw that the number of such daycare centers is low among Arab society. We saw that actually, in terms of willingness of the state, willingness of the ministry, there is a willingness to expand daycare centers, particularly in Arab municipalities. We see budgets that are designated and allocated, and a great willingness also among the Arab residents to do so. But it's not realized, this budget. It's not enforced. Half of the budgets are used to build and construct, but there are also other reasons for this. We try to understand what is the real goals, why only 50% of the budget allocated to build early childhood daycares in Arab cities is in fact used. Why is it not used? Is there not enough demand, or at the moment only that there will be an actual daycare center in the communities, people will use that? It has to do with planning obstructions, permits that are difficult to get in Arab, among the Arab sector, more difficult for Arabs to obtain. This is a big issue that was raised, and that is also noted in the State Ombudsman's report. And the final cause that we'll address has to do with the economic burden. One has to understand that the cost of such a center without subsidy is between 2,000 to 3,000 shekels a month. So if we look at this in regards to the average wage of a working Arab woman can be half of her wages. That's one problem. Another issue has to do with the fact that the cost of an alternative that is available in Arab society, which is significantly cheaper than because in Arab society there are private frameworks that are cheaper, and we saw that the cost of Arab private frameworks is about 700 to 1,000 shekels a month. That's a relatively affordable alternative in comparison to what I pay for my child. I pay for my daughter 3,500 for a private daycare a month in Kfar Saba. So that's if you have an alternative that is more affordable, or obviously that comes into a family's economic planning. We also talked about policy recommendations and policy options, and you can read about that. Thank you very much.
טוב, אז שלום.
Okay, hello to everybody. My name is Elad Demalach. I'm an economist in the Bank of Israel Research Division. I'm also a lecturer in the Tel Aviv University. I'm doing my doctorate track there. And thank you for Yossi to inviting me. And thank you to the organizers for dealing with this enormously important age group, early childhood. Our studies in collaboration with Tanya Baron from from the Ben Gurion University, and Professor Schlossel from Tel Aviv University, who's also my mentor in my PhD, and has been dealing with for many years now in this issue of early childhood frameworks and education in Arab society from various perspectives. Now, our study is the motivation for this conference really. Deals with the importance of the human capital, interests in dealing with early childhood, narrowing inequality, increasing social mobility. But it's not always empirically easy to understand the impact of early childhood, first of all, but not only because we have good data about the children, what happens to them later, and also because you see this data and you don't always know to distinguish between causality and correlation and really understand causal relationships if what happened in early childhood did create the impact later. And in order to grapple with this challenge, we did and sort of dealt with a natural experiment that happened in the 1990s and early 2000 in Israel, where the early mandatory law was enforced in some of the Arab communities. So let's begin with the background. In 1990, the attendance in of the ages of 0 to 3 among Arab children in some kind of framework was very, very low, maybe 20% at age 3 among Arab children, a bit bigger at the age of 4. It's very similar to what you saw in the latest presentation. So this was in age 3 and 4 specifically. And on this background, in September 1999, the compulsory preschool law was enforced. It was decided to begin with this enforcement. Prior to this, there was compulsory preschool only from age 5, what we call preschool. And this compulsory law, they began gradually, first of all, in the periphery, in the lower socioeconomic areas of Israel. And the idea was that gradually we would enforce it in more and more areas. It was only finally completed in 2015, by the way. And soon you'll see that this had a significant impact on the level of attendance in kindergartens among Arab society. It is important to note that there are other Arab towns that didn't experience this big change, or Arab towns that had a higher level of attendance at the age of 3 and 4. They were richer, but they were less poor than the poor of the poor. And here the law wasn't enforced and the low attendance rate continued. And there are other Arab towns that had maybe national preference, maybe they're on the conflict line, in which even prior to the compulsory law, they already got some kind kind of incentive to participate, and therefore they had lots of kindergartens and daycare centers, and therefore the compulsory law didn't change things very much there. But here we see the big difference in this area where I'm showing you here. We see that we can see that on the blue line, these are the areas that we see where the law was enforced, and within 2 years the number of children going to some kind of framework raised from 20% to 80% because of the enforcement of the compulsory education law. So what we see is that very quickly there was a significant increase in registration and attendance of Arab children in these areas at the age of 3 and at the age of 4. In contrast, age 5, it's an age where there was always compulsory education, not a significant difference at that age. So what do? This is a system that's called the difference of differences. We examine what happened to the children at the age of 3 or 4 prior to the enforcement of the compulsory law. They didn't go to some kind of frameworks. Comparing to children of that comparator age later on after the law, and in order to see not a general trend that happened overall in Arab society, to pinpoint the causality, we compare this difference to the corollary in those communities, Arab communities, where no more centers and frameworks were opened, and therefore we can pinpoint the cause of how this impacted Arab society. The point of which is that we assume that had there been no such law enacted in 1999, the changes over time in those areas would have changed similarly. No, we don't assume this. I mean, it's not like a perfect experiment. We don't have a control group that is clear in all parameters. By definition, the places in which the law was enforced were weaker. But we're assuming that even though they're weaker, it wouldn't have changed over time, and it would have changed. It remained relatively unchanged, relatively stable. And the data that we're using are basically the connection of the Central Bureau of Statistics data, and thank you very much to the Central Bureau of Statistics staff for helping us out for compiling this information, where we look at the data of Arab children in those specific towns relevant in the years of the study, and then connect that data to all sorts of administrative information from the Ministry of Education on Bagruyot, on matriculation exam results, Meitzav results. We have other findings, psychometric exam, and so forth. So and now I'm going to say and mention that these are finds based on a regression analysis. We will show you the various I'm not going to talk about the regression itself in the short amount of time. I mostly want to deliberate the findings. We want to look at the impact between completing a high school and matriculating. We can see a positive correlation in terms of participation or in matriculation and entitlement to matriculation. For example, entitlement is 4.7 meaning an increase from 40 to 44% overall in entitlement to matriculation because of the exposure of these communities to early childhood frameworks, whether it's and also in university acceptance. We can see that the matriculation also correlates to higher education when attending early childhood frameworks. We can see such a rise in those completing high school and the number of matriculation units that they completed. So that's in regards to, I mean, here already we can see that there was significant impact on the children that did go to some kind of framework to that childhood in terms of finishing high school and matriculating. This has to do with Meitzav score. I'm sure you know what Meitzav is. That has to do with or it has to do with literacy, mathematics, and reading and so forth at grade 4, conducted nationwide in Israel. And here we can see the impact on their grades in 5th grade. We could see a significant and a positive correlation and impact on math and language between a 10th to a percentile to an 11th percentile difference, a significant, statistically significant difference, and less impact on English and science. In 8th grade, we can see particularly the impact on language. So I think the most consistent finding is the positive impact of early childhood attendance on language. And in a sense, that makes sense, actually, because that's pretty logical, because the skill that are most relevant to these ages is language acquisition. Now, this really it relates to something that was said earlier today on the impact on various avenues and levels. For example, general education. This is a big benefit of the Central Bureau database that we know that delinquency and crime among Arab society in adolescent years is higher, and we particularly focus on the boys because that's where most delinquency is, and among the boy population we see a significant and statistically significant drop, of delinquency and crime of 3.8% in among Arab boys. So that's maybe 18%. That translates to an 18% drop in crime among Arab adolescents. And we can see what happens later to them in higher education. So we can have it also information about university and colleges, and also non-academic sectors, for example, practical engineering school and so forth. And what we can see here is a significant increase in attendance of higher education, a 16% increase to go to college or university or some kind of continued education later. I don't have a lot of time, but we did see also an impact on attendance in psychometric exams. That's clear, because if you're going to college, university, you need to have a psychometric exam. And we saw somewhat a drop of women or girls, being married at an early age, which is something that also exists in Arab society. Sadly, I don't have more time to expand upon this because there's a lot of interesting findings, but this is really tip of the iceberg. So I'll summarize. What we see is that the exposure to or attending a framework at early childhood because of the compulsory law improved children's language skills, their propensity to complete high school, lower delinquency and crime at adolescence, and increase the likelihood to go to college, university, and probably also postpone the age of marriage for young girls. So this is a basic summary of the findings, and what we can see is a positive impact on a lot of various dimensions from elementary school onwards to early adulthood even. So I would summarize and say that, first of all, that we can see that there's a significant impact to attendance of an early childhood framework to your success in future life. I mean, the study in Arab society focuses, of course, on Arab society as an important in that sense. But we can say generally that people from all low socioeconomic backgrounds can benefit particularly from such attendance. And this idea that this law suddenly created a change where children go to kindergarten at an early age, also in lower socioeconomic areas, had great impact on general education. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you for the truly compelling presentations. The task that I received is to try and respond to these findings and to review the very complex picture that emerges here, and to present the possible intervention options in these realms. I'd like to totally change the way by which I thought of building my response in view of Elad's study, which is truly mind-blowing, and I'll start from the end. From what we see in a very significant way emerging from the study presented by Elad is the so very clear connection between participation in educational frameworks and truly the last finding that it discussed, and the decrease in the risk of teenagers and later ages. If this is a significant finding, so let's first look at this and start by asking ourselves, how do we generate the various modes of actions when we talk about making these frameworks accessible? the significant finding is the connection between the change of legislation and then ultimately reducing gaps. If I start the conversation with a very complex picture of all the different modes of action in this space called state, namely local authorities and social options and government and very clear budgets allocated to different areas, but ultimately we see that one very significant change in legislation is the one that leads the budgeting changes and all the different other, government actions. But it is one in which in such a very short period of time, when you look at it from the research perspective, it creates such a change and such a difference. So we understand that we have to start by looking at our ability of influencing social policies in the state of Israel. And I have to say that this study put things into order for me. Let's take a step back and look at what Shavit presented. And perhaps it was Noam. I think it was Noam. The gap between the participation rate at the ages 0 to 3 and 3 to 6. We see a very specific influence of the presence of children in educational treatment and treatment frameworks in earlier ages to those who are older of 3 to 6. And we also see the comparison or between educated parents and less educated parents. And that brings us to the very complex picture of the situation we're in and point at various modes of actions that necessarily will have to be more complex in these contexts. If we say that the influence of participation in earlier ages differs, we have to ask ourselves why. What happens in these frameworks and how can we optimize them in a way that their influence will become more significant? Obviously, we have to go to the place of looking at our ability to operate at home with parents for the sake of parents. And moreover, we have to ask ourselves about the connection between the education of parents and participation in early childhood frameworks. This brings me, of course, to the thought, the very complex thought of who are we making these subsidies available? This is obviously a significant part of the very relevant discourse these days. Working parents, non-working parents, educated parents, non-educated parents, who need the subsidies more, and how do we generate the right scale of encouragement of those who need the encouragement and also supporting parents at home. And to those who cannot do this on their own, or those who are on the community level are not open to these options. And this brings me to what Shavit presented, and that's the community and cultural context of participation and our ability, or rather our need to adapt and accommodate for the various communities. It is very clear from what has been presented here that we cannot look neither at educated families or non-educated in the same way, not at families that live in a particular cultural community and others who live in a different community in the preliminary family orientation that leads them to the decision whether and how to send their children to those early childhood frameworks. This brings us to yet another thought, and that is the thought about the various modes of actions when it comes to changes of policy. It is true, I started by saying that in view of what Elad says, we see a direct link between changes of legislation and the rates of participation, but we also see in Shavit's study and also Noam's study the influence that the local space has on the rates of participation. And here we have to ask ourselves, what do we do about this with the local authorities so that we know how to accommodate to the needs of local places who are so different from one another. Obviously, everything is related to the social economic differences between different geographical locations, of course, and regretfully so. But this necessitates, you know, a very, very complex observation of what takes place. The place where I operate is the social philanthropic space. I am a director of a philanthropic fund that operates with NGOs and organizations whose aim is to encourage education and optimize early childhood education in the state of Israel. I think that the one thing that I can take, and I do hope that all of us will be taking from this for our continued operation, is that this picture ostensibly is so complex that there's not one sector or one agency that should operate in it. The very warm, you know, words said about Ministry of Welfare or Ministry of Education and Ministry of Finance and their involvement. You need a lot more than just one agency or ministry to deal with the social economic gaps that result from the treatment of early childhood. It's true that we have to unequivocally define the different frameworks that operate in the role of each of them, but we should also create some sort of a statement that is more holistic, that deals with the different facets of operation, that has to do with the government, with the local authority, with the organizations that are actually managing those frameworks, that also pertain to the teachers and the various modes of actions. In other words, truly, we have a situation here that is extremely complex when it comes to its needs, and also the possibilities of treatment and accessibility of that treatment. And perhaps there's some optimism in it too. We see that it's possible. We see that with certain changes and certain influences, we ultimately do make a difference. And that's what matters. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We will now, all the members of the panel will come to the stage and sit along the table. When it comes to the rules of safety, those who speak will remove their masks, and those who do not speak will keep their masks on. So hello, everyone. We're now all seated together. So many things came up and so many things were said about studies and about the early childhood systems. There was an emphasis given to the Arab society and the differences involved. And I'd like us to start with our own discussion, things that you wanted to say and that you didn't say to one another and to the audience. When actually we say that in early childhood, well, it's hard to talk about early childhood and mandatory education law. Obviously, there are many, many alternatives, and it's the choice made by parents, and it's a cultural thing. And we do not have any statement that says that early childhood systems are the only alternative. No, but given that this is a very influential, beneficial framework for populations at risk, we would like to see how we do this in the best and most accessible and accommodating way for the time point that we're in. Today, we have this window of opportunity. The supervision law created a turning point. This will be discussed in the next panel, of course. I have to say that legislation is not all there is. it's only the threshold, because ultimately you have to interpret and implement this legislation in a very, very suitable way, and it has to have a budget, and that too is challenging, but it leaves the responsibility not in the hands of the government nor the legislator, but rather the ones who need to meet the criteria, and sometimes they don't have the wherewithal and the resources. So I'd really like to ask all of you, not according to the order of sitting, but let's just do it and see if we can truly make good quality frameworks for early childhood more accessible to different sectors in the Israeli society. What are the accelerators and what are the barriers from the point of view of your research or any other perspective that you can bring as Israeli citizens? Noam, would you like to be the first one? I will bring up one of the points that are trivial. I won't say anything new. And that's also presented in the studies, Shavit and Elad's. And that's the point pertaining to costs. In our study, you can see the importance of these years in the early childhood frameworks, especially for, poor populations, weaker populations. There are reasons why poor or weaker populations are less present in early childhood systems. And one of them is the very simple financial calculation. The cost of these frameworks is high. And not everywhere do you have a WITSO facility. And even when there is an NGO that finances it more fully or partially, it's never in full. And the economic calculation for weaker families is very significant. In this sense, I believe I was looking for why this change resulting from the Trachtenberg Committee that reduced the level of mandatory education, did it impact more the weaker strata? I believe so, because it became more accessible for them, for sure. So I just wanted to bring up this point. Thank you very much. Of course, I presented this very briefly, the whole idea of the economic burden. Definitely that has some bearing, but just as I said, there are so many factors that can influence the participation in Israel compared to other countries. We do not have any survey of priorities of parents of children in early childhood. We cannot provide a very reliable answer as to what is the major factor that can explain the choice of parents to participate or not to participate in different frameworks. There is a very wide range of frameworks. There are bigger ones of daycares, and there are all those smaller ones of 10 and 5 children, and some would just prefer to have a caregiver at home. The range is very, very wide, and we do not have today any data or any solid survey that would truly represent the preferences of parents and that can perhaps explain to us why they prefer those frameworks to others. And of course, there are different cultural explanations and others, and also explanations which are expressed in what Elad presented that are related to policy decisions like, the subsidies. This has a major influence to begin with on the participation rates. So there are so many parameters and it's very, very wide. Thank you. Okay, so I will truly try to think what we can learn from the study that I presented earlier about the limitation factors of accessibility. So after all this disclaimer, and I said that we looked at older ages of the 1990s, I think that what took place in that change of legislation was a number of components, all of which together brought to this rapid change. First of all, there was the regulatory decision the legislation of changing the age, actually shaping a norm with regulation. So now we have mandatory education law for these ages. And it's not that it's truly enforced and parents who do not send their kids are fined. No, this is perceived as something compulsory or binding. That's one component. Definitely the component of budget had to accompany it, and you had to unequivocally increase the supply. It was discussed, the topic of daycares in the Arab society, but there were no infrastructures in the 1990s. There were no kindergartens. So you had to very quickly establish that infrastructure, but that was done. And various facilities were opened, and that was an important stage. And also the third component of having free education. The cost definitely plays a role. And sometimes even the subsidized cost that seems to be cheap or low in a poor society, it might be perceived as expensive. So the free component was definitely important. So the change of law and the free education and the budgets that were given for the building of daycare centers, that brought up a very major increase in participation within 2 years. And I think that that's a type of a response to the complaint that says that the problem is on the side of demand, that families do not wish to send their kids to kindergarten settings because of different cultural considerations. But in this case, we do not see that. We saw that as soon as that was done, there was a major change that followed. So can there be a connection between this issue and the issue of the participation of women in the Arab sector? Yes. In other words, what we saw in Shavit's presentation, in the Arab sector, only 40% of the women worked. So by definition, if the daycare centers are given for working parents, then most people in the Arab society are not entitled for subsidies in daycare centers. Definitely, this is one of the implications. Correct me if I'm wrong. In the previous study, you did see a certain contribution of this law for the increasing number of women who participate in the labor market. Definitely so. The opposite influence, that's a part of it. What's the justification to subsidize daycare centers for working people? That is to encourage women to go to work. Ultimately, there are a number of aspects. There is the benefit of the child when you encourage employment of women, and there's also the employment of women and their participation in the labor market. I'd like to add one layer to this conversation. Quite naturally, the researchers here come from specific fields, but substantially, one of the things that is happening is the lack of trust of parents in those frameworks that do exist in Israel. So here there is another aspect that we have not yet discussed, and that is the training of those who gave treatment in those frameworks. Obviously, you do not see this in the data that you presented, but this layer has to be added to our conversation concerning how to encourage parents to send their kids, to just give trust to these settings so that they would allow them to give them what they can give them. And the whole idea of training the workforce in those treatment educational frameworks, and the directors and the caregivers and the assistants and the entire wide workforce that is present in those daycare centers. And I definitely link to the topic of encouragement of employment, but the significant part of caregivers are women. we can influence so many areas and reduce gaps if we only recognize this profession of treatment education in early childhood as one that requires teaching and development, that sees these women. Perhaps we'll start from there before we do so many other things. So thank you very much. This issue is indeed pertaining to the definition of this field as a profession, and all that has to do with a profession that derives from training and teaching and preparation processes. It's a chicken and the egg in a way. It is a process that so much can be done about its image, and that quite leads us to the supply of workforce, of manpower. There's a very high rate of turnover. I won't elaborate on this because I'm sure you all know the data, but definitely this issue, as well as the gender issue that we mentioned, by the way, is extremely important in this field, and also the professional training and coaching, which is so very much a part of this process. One last short question has to do with, so who should sit around the table? We're talking with the government agencies, local authorities. We see them very present lately, and the place of the local authority in the COVID context of all other contexts became a lot more prominent. The importance of those local authorities, parents as being a part of the story, their choices, the cultural differences. So who should make this ecosystem grow as an ecosystem and not as something you do here and there, not in a very organized joint way that would lead to results? So let's start with the other way around this time. From the place I come from, the answer is very, very natural. And I said this earlier, there are different fields of operation in a democratic society in general, and in the Israeli society in particular. We have the very strong body of the National Council for Early Childhood. This council should be strengthened and expand its modes of action, and to make it more significant in order to link so many dots in this space. And these dots include the networks, the social organization, the agencies, the philanthropists, the donors, the professional foundations that view this from a very professional point of view. And all that has to be orchestrated and be part of the discussion, which is a wide public discussion. And as we said earlier, it pertains to so many elements in the democratic society in Israel that it cannot be left in one sphere alone. Thank you. Elad. Okay. I would like to say that I'd like to talk about this topic as a researcher in Bank of Israel, because it's not directly linked with the presentation that I made earlier. Bank of Israel came not too long ago, less than a month ago, we came up with a strategic comprehensive document concerning the acceleration of growth in the economy and productivity in various other channels. And one of the main axes of this document is investment in human capital. And in this document, there's also a central place given to the importance of investing in early childhood. The importance there has, from what we argue, has to be both focused on the weaker populations, where the return on investment in this education is the highest. This is where it most pays off to invest. And also in the quality of this education, namely that would address the need of public quality education. So that's our contribution to this. Thank you. I'll truly relate to the subject of the multiple players in the field. We understood in the studies and in the interviews that there are so many players that we never believed would have so much influence, that the local authority is a major influence on whether a new daycare would be opened or not. If there's no willingness on this part of the local authority, so no matter how much we push it, it won't happen. Even if financing is given, but if there's no willingness on the part of the local authority, very often daycare centers are not established only because of this. And that's an important issue. Who actually is the central manager of this entire field? It doesn't have to be included or dependent on who the mayor is right now or various political considerations, because that's a truly horizontal, wall-to-wall topic. It's everyone's kids, and it shouldn't get stuck on political, agendas. There is a need, perhaps, to rehash this topic, whether the regulator or the local authorities or any other elements can actually take this over. You talk about the national systemic planning beside the importance of the local authority. In any case, of course, the local government is a very important partner. The question is how the collaboration between them works and who is the authority that ultimately has the final say. Thank you. I'd like to say two things about the reasons or what the role of everyone is. The role of the state in the early ages, before it assumes responsibility at the age of 3, is to design incentives for families in such a way that would make parents send their kids to these frameworks, and that would quite naturally allow mothers to work more freely, especially in those sectors where the percentage of women's participation in the labor market is low. Because in some of the sectors, the subject of early childhood is more complex, and in others, less. There has to be, I believe, collaboration quite significantly with parents, with local entities, with if you talk about the Arab sector, then a lot more cooperation to design those frameworks in such a way that they will have trust in them, as Tali said earlier, and that all other barriers would be removed by this collaboration. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions? So, questions, comments? Any observation? Can anyone help with the microphone? Is it working? My question relates to something that Tali brought up concerning who is eligible for that subsidy. I'd be very happy to hear what you find in the studies, because I'd be very happy if this decision would have been professional rather than political. Can you, from a bird's eye view, define the parameters you would give in order to address this question, when we bear in mind those populations that are more in need of these solutions? Tali, did you introduce yourself? We need to know who the Tali Neer, the Director General of the NGO 121. We work with parents, field people, teachers, and our goal is what came up at the end of the previous round, and that is the quality of treatment offered. And encouraging the state to invest in trainings and for staffs of daycares. Who would like to respond? I think that even though there are many studies conducted and presented, I think it's something that is quite consistent in all of them. If you ask who we should invest in and where we should invest in early childhood, then it's in those populations that come from a weaker background. Their domestic environment is less stimulating than those frameworks, and we saw this from different angles. So if we ask where we need to focus on, most would say that it's here. And there are those who argue that it has to be universal and equal to all, but this is what we can argue over, whether we should subsidize it to all. I'd like to only add, and that also links with what I said earlier, in order to address this question, we should first of all define the role of those frameworks, because if we want to use them as a tool to incentivize employment, it's one thing. If we want to use them as a tool for a very accessible educational environment, that's something else. First of all, I'd like to define what those settings are and what their goal is. The chicken and the egg is such that we cannot, define what will happen first. Will the child be able to join the framework and then his mom will go out to work, or the other way around? So it's going to be very, very difficult to say if we defined that the role of those frameworks is to bring women to the labor market. By the way, I don't know how that would impact those frameworks or characters. Actually, there are contradictions. If we say that it's a double job, it has to do with the central role of the mother, and we do have indications that when they expanded frameworks in the Arab sector, for example, it increased the participation of women in the labor market. It's as if you say, first of all, get a job and then find a solution for your toddler. So it's more of an ethical or a political question rather than a professional one, but it definitely underlies many of the issues discussed. When we talk about quality frameworks, we don't necessarily talk about women's participation in the labor market, but rather the quality for the children. We talk about the meaning, the significance of that framework in the life of a child, in the most immediate and long-term way, the right to have a framework and the long-term impact over the child's achievements and performance. This is the leading discourse, and the very fact and the statement that brings us back to allowing mothers or parents to work and the child would be kept in that framework to allow parents to work is exactly the opposite statement to things and insights that we've gained in the last few years that brought us to a whole different situation. You cannot say it's only this or it's only that. First of all, it's an educational quality framework, and its influence was extensively discussed here, but necessarily it doesn't contradict the fact that we should look at other aspects. There's no such topic, definitely not this, which is so complex, namely early childhood, but the leading factor is that of the perception and the attitude, and what has been revealed here in the last hour and a half, the quality of framework, their sensitivity towards kids and families and every other aspect involved, and not as, a child being a tool to allow his parents to go to work. That, I believe, has been, an anticlimax for many, many years. So once again, thank you. It was important for me to say that. I think we're nearing the end of the session. Okay. The discussion here is going in various important directions. So what I'm about to say, and just imagine that I said this 20 minutes ago. It's very important for me to emphasize that there are two studies that Elad and Noam presented, which discuss a very similar problem, and that is what are the long-term influences or impacts of participation in frameworks in a country where frameworks, when it comes to the standards of quality, are bad. And still, those two studies that were done by using different methods in different populations lead to very similar conclusions, whether it's the Arab population in the lower deciles in a particular point, or whether we talk about a national study. Elad's study is a lot stronger when it comes to causality, and you can believe the findings a lot more in that sense. And Noam's study is weaker in that sense, but a lot broader, with an external validation of a higher standard, but they converge. And it's good to read these two studies together, and also to ask whether quality is not overrated, because I know that we all say the opposite. But here, lo and behold, we see that with all the terrible problems that the system has, and I can only imagine how it is in those Arab localities in which those institutions were invented ex nihilo, as it were, and the system was not that, well functioning. We see how important the very participation in those frameworks is. It was important for me to emphasize this point. I don't know if Sima returned. But it's important to say to Sima, following what Tali said earlier, that Sima is the integrator. It's very important that the council would assume a research role, to be an integrator in the research sense. The fact that we just invent various, documents in the National Bureau of Statistics and do qualitative work, it's all well and done, and it's simply because we Israelis are improvising by nature. But if we, in Germany, we would have a very organized database, and we would use it, and we wouldn't need anyone's favor, and perhaps even make decisions based on these data. And I'll end by saying that in the framework of the operation of the council as an integrator, it would give some thought to that and make sure that scholars would have a real, authentic database that can be trusted. I suggest that Sima would relate to this, because there's a lot to say when it comes to the plans and the programs of the council. I'll share this when I discuss the supervision law. But when it comes to Yossi's last remarks, the law necessitates the establishment of a center of studies and knowledge that groups together all the studies that are done on children from the age 0 to 6. So I do hope that we enter a somewhat more optimistic era, and that we would very quickly be able to advance this topic as well. It's very important to say something about free education to 3-year-olds in the Arab sector and in general. I believe free as a concept is not the only measure whether people participate more or less. I think that Elad talk about exposure of early childhood. We do not talk about exposure. We talk about quality frameworks for early childhood. And those who were a part of the implementation of the free education, and then, of course, the mandatory education, which is a whole different law. At one point, they converge, of course, but what brought parents to choose those frameworks. And I'd like to remind you of all the noises that we had from the private sector, was ultimately the quality of work, the supervision, the very organized framework of the Ministry of Education, And also, we'll talk about this later when we talk about 0 to 3-year-old and the supervision law. When it comes to the Arab sector, I have a lot to say, but they started already in 1999 or even earlier. They've gone a long way. And if we talk about trust, then a lot of work was done to build that trust within the local government, among the families and the communities. And today we know that there are more than 90% of the children who are in the system. And these are good kindergartens. They are quality kindergartens. And I think that that's where the strength lies. Do we have enough time for another question? Yes, please. Can I talk without the mic? Thank you. My name is Yariv from the Haifa University. I did not think to respond if it weren't for Yossi's provocation concerning the overrating of quality. My feeling from the presentations is that quality is underrated. There was no reference to quality. There's no doubt that if the elements or the variables of quality were included in the bank of variables, you would have seen a lot more significant findings. Some of the problem of quality could be seen in this curved graph of ages 3 to 6. So that's my comment concerning the overrated the quality issue brought up by Yossi. I'd like to connect between things, between what Yair and Yossi said earlier. I wish we had these variables. Early childhood, 0 to 3, suffers in Israel from lack of data. We can only be based on what we can find. It's not a lot, it's not everything. So even though we did look to find for quality measures, but we couldn't find them. Thank you so much. I think that definitely, I think we have to end. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the panelists of the first session. These are truly compelling data, and we shall now take a 30-minute break. We invite you, the participants, to a coffee break in the lobby of Mishkanot Sha'ananim. You'll be able to follow the signs to know how to get there, and we'll be back in the hall at 11:30 for the second session and discuss the supervision law.